It is 3/2 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Alexander Kojeve, his phenomenology of right. It's not a philosophy of right. It's not a logic. It is a phenomenology of right. Kojeve wrote this work at the age of 41. It was 4 years after his world-famous, world-shattering lectures on Hegel at the age of 37 in 1939. So this was 1943 when he put together his phenomenology of right concerning law and obligation, and the phenomenology that underlies that law and obligation, as opposed to a formal logic. He wants to begin with phenomena in the sensate experience, and he doesn't want to just jump straight to logic like a philosophy of right might do. So basically he takes a further step from his Hegelian lectures and wants to address the idea of justice in a very formal way. During the same time, he had written a very informal conversational document of about 100 pages that he circulated through the French government called The Notion of Authority, but that was in no way meant to be a formal treatment like this phenomenology of the right. So this is his major work on law and obligation, but he wants his readers to begin by understanding a very brief structure that he's willing to present to allow us to get a little bit of a thought picture before we jump in here. And so he gives it to us in 3 moments of presentation, debate, and notion. 3 moments of presentation, debate, and notion, all situated on the psyche side of humanity, on the side of our encounter with sensate phenomena. So it's going to be a very tightly structured intro, but it's going to be tightly structured within a phenomena and sensate experience. Now, under presentation, he tells us that the idea of right reveals and unveils itself to us through a realization process that it has with the spatio-temporal realm of historical existence. Essentially, it does unveil the idea of justice. This realization creates its own self-positing of itself as an underlying objective phenomena within temporal history. At this level, we are doing strictly a behaviorist analysis. There's no universality that's being considered at this point. We are solicited by a juridical situation of right. It solicits us and interrogates us. The relation of right is latently present within the historical moment, within the historical concretion, and this latency is perceived as that which could have an objective effect if we take it up and decide to posit what it presents, if we decide to posit its notion. So that's the aspect of solicitude. It must be seen as something that is latently present and objectively effective as a positing. Now, the precondition for a juridical situation with a juridical essence includes there must be the latent presence of the droit idea of right, and that idea must be perceived as desirable and realizable, and there must be also the presence of the implicating of the subject through the concept of obligatory duties. There must be a sense of being solicited and interrogated toward an authentic taking up of an obligation, of duty. In other words, something that a crisis in that presentation that calls for decision. Now, the methodological steps that Kojeve gives us: number one, we have the intuitive sensate encounter with the external form of the latent underlying droit idea of right, that it's working its way through its own realization. We discern the externally perceptible actions of this idea of right. And when we do that, we partition off the juridical percepts into a separate psyche workspace. So we do form some initial juridical percepts, and then we partition them off to their own respective workspace internally within our own self-consciousness. And then we look at the situation and we determine what material possibilities are present for true juridical action of justice. We do this by an initial reflective action. And then we finally look through the interpretive filter of the juridical percepts that we've gathered and examine the situation through the window of right and obligation. So we end up reflectively constructing a very simplistic first behaviorist model of the droit idea of right, which is, like I say, very much a intuitive with maybe some just first level reflective activity, but it is a model, it is a behaviorist model, and it's a distinguished model that is recognizable, but Kojeve says at this point, obviously it is not fully defined, it is not fully understood. It just simply gives us that initial beginning of a mechanical memory collectivity of juridical percepts, not concepts, but percepts. Now we move into the exchange of dialogue with others as kind of a debate at that Da Kunta threshold that is very much a part of Hegel's philosophy and postmodern philosophy for that matter. So the Da Kunta threshold of debate is a transition point of taking the behaviorist model, the simplistic behaviorist model we put together, to the next level of its reaching a more mature, objective, progressive presentation. We carry our phenomenological model, and Kojeve said it will consist of the following. It'll have a well-defined structure. That structure will enclose the juridical percepts. There will be a recognition of the provisional nature of this model at this point. It certainly isn't hardened into stone. It's not even hardened into concept yet. So it's open to revision. We enter into a dialectic of a co-determination and repercussion. When we get into a debate-type dialogue with others at the threshold, and this becomes a second moment for Kojeve that constitutes a new metaphysics. It becomes a metaphysical model simply because you're transcending the individual phenomenological model through debate and intersubjectivity. So debate and intersubjectivity formulate and are the foundation for Kojeve's new metaphysics. So we do have a metaphysical model, but it is certainly not the metaphysics of old. It is an intersubjective metaphysic born out of this sous-étasis debate. But we have progressed from the behaviorist phenomenological model to the intersubjective metaphysical model of probably still percepts. If there are any concepts at all, they're going to be proto-concepts. They're not going to be formally formed into a lexical content of concepts yet. They could be proto-conceptual, but probably still clinging to the level of percept. Now from here we're going to enter into the third moment of notion, and at this point, Kojeve says we introduce the posited third party. The disinterested third party is posited as an infiltration into the sous-étasis debate between subject A and subject B, between these conversing parties. That introduces the concept of universality And that is essential if we're going to transition from this neo-metaphysics to a neo-ontology. You have to introduce the concept of universality. So it allows us, this positing of a third party, a neutral third party, helps us to make room for the transition to the ontological model. The ontological is reached by determining which of the evolving metaphysical proto-concepts can be sustained in an intersubjective way and thereby gain a universality assigned to them and give them a real opportunity to evolve the concept. This constitutes the realm of the real. Hegel called it the realm of the true. It's a play on words there, but Kojeve calls this the realm of the real, which anticipates the next moment of positing and a positing within the realms of society and state. And in his first series of lectures on Hegel, this is when we transition from the prioritizing of the master and realize that we have to go out of ourselves by giving a priority to the slave who is going to become involved in the praxis type of positing. So it's a transitional area, and it's the notion of the real for Kojeve instead of the notion of the true. It's the notion of the real. It's a internally posited externality of reality. And I guess that's a good way to put it, because it is the real. It is not the actual at this point. It's an internal externality. That's what positing is all about. It's that interpretive window at the front of your mind. But that's the real. That's the real for Kojeve. It was the real for Hegel. The real is not the sensate world that you live in. The real is what you make of that sensate world. How do you live in that sensate world? What do you identify as meaningful for your life? What do you identify as life-changing and hopeful and challenging and soliciting and obligatory? It's what you interpret through your own interpretive window as to what you're going to call the real. So reality is not the sensate world out there that you're walking in, talking in, and moving in. It's there, but it is the internal externality of the filtering interpretive window that is right there at your prefrontal cortex. It's right there hinged at the prefrontal cortex, and you are viewing through it all the time, whether you're self-consciously aware of it or not. You're always viewing through that internal externality of a posited interpretive framework through which you can say this is the real. Or for Hegel, this is the true. So he takes us to this third moment of notion, but in the moment of notion, we start to arrive to the universality of concepts, and we arrive at the universality of also the feeling of an obligation to enter the totality of being, which means we must take up positing. That's what the master-slave parable taught us, and Kojeve is going to live by that master-slave parable, which is, remember, it's entirely internal to the human self-consciousness. Both the master and the slave live within individual self-consciousness, and it becomes an axis flip when we go out of the ideal master conceptual model to the slave's practical and practical shaped praxis model. There has to be an axis flip within the phenomenological individual consciousness. It has to be rooted in phenomenology here. That's the underlying structure for an ethics, according to Kojeve and Hegel, especially from a postmodern point of view. But it's going to be that type of a phenomenology and not a formal logic. So he gives us basically the presentation of the idea of right trying to realize itself in a self-positing underlying latency that wants to become a posited tendency within the spatio-temporal. We have to learn how to allow it to interrogate us and solicit our obligatory response as a true duty. We have to perceive it as desirable and realizable, and then we will be willing to take up the positing. But there are those steps of first the intuitive encounter, because it begins as an external form, but then you're going to look at the actions within the external form, and you're going to start doing a little bit of initial reflective work and forming some judicial percepts of right and obligation, some judicial percepts of right and obligation. That's going to help you shape that idea of the right into a model, a distinguished first behaviorist model. But you want to take that a little bit further. To do so, you're going to have to actually enter into dialogue. You can't be an island. So if you want to take it further, you enter into dialogue at the Dekunta threshold, and you begin to working out a neo-metaphysical model that will enter the moment of structuring. We actually get into what he says is a well-defined structure when we enter into communal dialogue, and that's going to enclose those juridical percepts, and we're going to start to move on to a communal co-determination of helping all of this reach some form of universality. It has to reach some form of obligatory universality that challenges us and asks us to make the master-slave axis flip and start being concerned about forming a praxis ethics. So we cannot evacuate this initial diagram from Kojeve's underlying years of lecturing in Paris on the master-slave parable, because that's going to be fundamental to his position here. It's just that now he wants to take that master-slave parable and become political, and we'll be examining this as we go. He's going to expand this very brief outline. He's going to expand it quite a bit. We're going to have a ton of content as we go. So all we can really say is that we have a very initial framework of presentation, communal debate, and the notion of the real, not the true, but the notion of the real as kind of a universality of reality as an internal externality of positing. So that's a very brief glimpse at what he wants to do, and he is going to expand this with a lot of content, and we'll get into that as we continue.